business, if you're a legal firm, you have no obligation to hire people who support baby murderers.
Actually, Hamas started this whole thing. Remember October 7th? Actually, that's wrong. Before October 7th, Israeli security forces killed 248 Palestinians, and 40 of them were children, and that was just this year. And if you want to go back further than that, we can look at the recent history of war crimes committed by the Israeli government. Operation Protective Edge in 2014, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, Operation Cast Lead in 2009.
What started each one of those operations? Islamic barrages of rockets into civilian centers in Israel. That's what started each one of these operations. I love this moron. I guess the idea here is that if you point out that what has caused the current conflict is the massacre of 1,500 Jews, like, well, before that, Israel killed other Palestinians. And you're like, yeah, but why would they do that? And the answer is because they were associated with terrorist groups. And he's like, yeah, but what about the conflict before? Oh, you mean because the terrorists were firing rockets into Israel? It's an infinite regress of dumb here. Just name a bunch of operations without actually explaining why the operations were initiated.
Yeah, but you don't mention why Cast Lead happened. Hamas fired rockets into Israel. And that was because Israel broke the ceasefire agreement they had on November 4th, 2008, while the entire world was in euphoria over the United States electing its first black president, Barack Obama. Israel used the opportunity to break the ceasefire agreement and raid Gaza and kill Palestinians.
For no reason, they're just raiding Gaza, just for fun. They just raid Gaza. To do what exactly? To steal their nothing? What would the raid entail? What would be the purpose of such a raid? Can you explain? Like, what are the great valuable jewels being held in Gaza that the Israelis desperately need to get their hands on? Israel so desperately wanted not to be in Gaza that they surrendered the place to a fucking terrorist group for 20 years, who then spent every last dime building rockets and terror tunnels so as to murder 1,500 Jews. And one thing that I've noticed, they keep saying they're running out of power, they're running out of fuel, they're running out of water. You know the thing they haven't been running out of? Rockets.
Well, you're leaving out a lot of context. You got to go back further than that. To 1967? Yeah, let's go back to 1967, when Israel started a preemptive war.
Egypt was mobilizing its air force.
Syria and Jordan, and took more land from Palestine, further enclosing Palestinians into the Gaza Strip. They illegally occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in what has been formally condemned ever since 1967 as an illegal occupation in violation of international law, unilaterally condemned by the World Court.
Who gives a shit about the World Court? You mean organizations staffed by people who hate Israel, and the UN and the Red Cross?
Like, the UN, the Red Cross,
oh my God,
the Geneva Conventions,
the Geneva Conventions.
Consensus.
He's doing this in defense of Hamas. The Geneva Conventions.
In the world, all call on Israel to return to its pre-June 1967 borders.
That's not even true. That's not even true. Even the UN resolutions, which are garbage and stupid, even those UN resolutions call on Israel to surrender some of the occupied territories. Not all occupied territory. Those are disputed territories. Some occupied territories.
Yeah, but you're missing more context. You got to go back to 1948. Okay, let's go back to
1948.
In 1948, Zionists extirpated about 1 million Palestinians from their homes and forced them to relocate to the Gaza Strip.
What? Excuse me, in 1947-48, there was a full-scale war between Arabs and Israelis. Somewhere between 700 and 800,000 Palestinians either fled or were expelled from areas where there was military activity. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left in the lead-up to the war and during the war because all social services had collapsed because the Arab nations were telling them to get out. The other part is that you may have noticed many Arabs remain, which is why 20% of Israel's population currently is Israeli Arab. The Gaza Strip was then governed by Egypt. I don't see this guy calling for Egypt to form a Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip. The West Bank was completely occupied by Jordan from 48 to 67. No call for a Palestinian state. Weird. Weird. Again, the Jews took in 800,000 expelled Jews from all the Muslim countries in the region during the same period, took in all of them. I don't see this guy calling for return of the Jews to their historic homelands of Morocco, their historic homeland of Egypt and Iraq.
Today, about 70% of all Gazans are considered refugees from the 1948 expulsion.
Okay, pause that for a second. How is that even possible? Seriously, how's that even possible? Well, folks, unfortunately, there's a lot of crap out there that is just like this, and so we had to do a part 2. That's coming shortly.
Now, let's go back to 1967, when Israel started a preemptive war.
Egypt was mobilizing its air force.
Syria. Yes, Egypt mobilized its military within its borders, which last time I checked is not a violation of international law. But do you know what is a violation of international law? Firing first strike missiles into Egypt from Israel. That's why I said Israel started a preemptive war against Egypt. You can read a book on this matter, or you could simply just go to the Wikipedia page to find the most basic information, such such as who started the war in 1967. And back up for a second, do you even know why Egypt mobilized its military in the Sinai? Because a month earlier, in May 1967, before the war broke out, Israel threatened Syria and made plans to attack. Legally occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in what has been formally condemned ever since 1967 as an illegal occupation in violation of international law, unilaterally condemned by the World Court.
About the World Court.
Nobody gives a shit about the World Court is what he just said. This man is completely off the rails in his rapacious defense of the current bloodletting in Gaza. This is actually a very revealing moment for Ben. The World Court, aka the International Court of Justice, is an arm of the United Nations. The United Nations is largely a creation of the United States. It is certainly controlled by the United States. No institution is more sympathetic, cowering, absolving of Israel and the United States than the United Nations. That is why some in the media expressed shock last week when they heard the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres cast the slightest bit of shade to Israel when he said,
"It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing."
You mean organizations staffed by people who hate Israel and the UN and the Red Cross?
It is truly wild to hear such a pro-capitalist Western neoliberal decry the very global institutions which have been brought to us by Western capitalism and who serve the interests of Western capitalism. But just as a democratic government, corrupt as it is, still remains the one political avenue by which people can have agency over their lives, so does the UN remain the one political avenue by which countries can have their voices heard and a world consensus be formulated. In other words, there's much obviously wrong with the UN, but I don't think that the principles expressed in the articles of its charter are necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a good thing that we have international laws and diplomatic mechanisms in place to resolve conflicts between countries, to prevent war crimes. Ben's obvious disdain for international laws, standards, and practices reveals to me what is commonly understood as American exceptionalism. Rules for thee, not for me. The United States gives orders, it is under no obligation to follow them.
Geneva Conventions.
Scoffing at the Geneva Conventions is truly wild, if for no other reason than for the simple fact that it was expressly created in the wake of World War II, primarily forged by the United States, in order to prevent another mass atrocity like the Holocaust.
Raiding Gaza, just for fun. They just raid Gaza. To do what exactly? To steal their nothing?
Gee, I really wonder what could be the overall goal of raiding the Gaza Strip periodically over time. Surely the answer just evades me. It's such a mystery. I'm sure it has nothing to do with Israeli finance minister and self-described fascist homophobe Bezalel Smotrich donning a map of Greater Israel at a press conference.
What would the raid entail? What would be the purpose of such a raid? Can you explain?
Happy to explain, but I can just let Israeli government officials do it for me. The purpose of operations like Cast Lead and Protective Edge are part of what former military commander and Prime Minister Ariel Sharon called Israel's main weapon, its deterrence capacity. It's a direct quote. Israel's deterrence strategy, spelled out formally by the IDF in what they refer to as their Dahia Doctrine, which I encourage people to research, centered on waging preemptive asymmetrical warfare against a civilian population and its infrastructure in order to instill fear in Israel's rivals within the region. In 2006, before these three operations that I cited in my previous video, although there are many others, two important things happened. One, Israel lost a war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Facing humiliation, the IDF, in accordance with their Dahia Doctrine, once again needed a punching bag to remind everyone within the region that Israel was not to be messed with. And predictably, they turned to defenseless Gaza. As one former Israeli foreign minister put it, Israel's real foe is not Hamas, it is the memory of 2006. Or, as other Israeli government officials put it at the time, Gaza is to Lebanon what a second sitting for an exam is to the first. A second chance to get it right. The second important thing that happened in 2006 was that Hamas did what the U.S. had been urging it to do. It participated in an election. Hamas just made one grave mistake. It actually won the election in what President Jimmy Carter, who was there at the time, described as a completely fair and honest election. That's a direct quote. And the international community, aside from the United States and Israel, of course, agreed. This was, of course, unacceptable to the United States and Israel. Why? Because Israel and the United States could not afford having Hamas look as if it is a legitimate democratic governing body. Hamas had also signaled that it was in support of the world consensus, implementing a two-state solution. Of course, the only countries that are against a two-state solution in the world are Israel and the United States. So, in order to oust Hamas as the governing body in Palestine, Israel, along with the United States, planned a military coup against the government. Hamas sniffed it out and stopped it. After Hamas successfully warded off the coup, Israel began planning its Operation Cast Lead, which was, as the UN's fact-finding investigative report concluded in 2009, designed to humiliate, punish, and terrorize the civilian population in order to break their support for Hamas and fracture Gaza once again.
Nixon ordered Cambodian genocide. Clinton sent cruise missiles to Sudan, people died. Obama gave the orders to do drone strikes. Reagan invaded Nicaragua in '85.